Hey everyone. So in my last video I talked a little bit about bitterness towards God and how this is an incredibly natural and normal thing to go through whenever we go through any type of trauma or issue in our life. And I took a lot of time to show that even the people in the Bible really struggled with this problem. How could a good God who's in control of everything allow this kind of horror and suffering and trauma into my life as well as the lives of those around me? A very, very difficult question to answer, and one that, like I said, a lot of the Bible is dedicated towards trying to help us understand and to be able to accept. Now, in this video, what I'm going to be talking about is how can we deal with that anger before God? How can we move past it? And I gave you one principle in the last video, and that is you got to start talking to God about it. Right? Don't hold that in. Don't hide it. The more you hide it, the more you hold it in, the worse it will get. It will fester. Start communicating with God the best you can about what you're feeling and why you're feeling that way. Really be honest with Him and open up. 1 Peter chapter 4, it says, cast your cares upon God, for He cares for you, right? He wants to hear you out. He wants to listen. And He will have some good comfort for you, for sure. But now let's talk about some of the principles that we can incorporate in our lives that are going to help us to move past that anger, to be able to trust God again, and to be able to have faith in what He's doing in our lives. And again, I don't talk about this stuff in a casual way. I know that these are some really, really difficult and intimate problems that we can struggle with, that suffering. And again, I don't know what you've been through personally, but I know that there are some horrific, horrific things that people could go through. And even me, myself, coming back from my first deployment, not only the things that happened to me, not only the things that I saw happen to my friends, but the things that I saw happen in that country, that happen every day because of the wickedness that goes on there, that's allowed to exist there, it was almost too much for me. It really caused me to doubt my faith in God, in His presence at all, but even in His goodness. Maybe there is a God out there, but maybe He just doesn't care. Right? That was kind of one of the things that I had believed for a long period of time. I've wrestled with this question for a lot of my life, and I know I'll continue to wrestle with it. It's not an easy answer, and I don't want this to seem like I'm giving casual answers to really, really painful things. However, these are some of the principles that have helped me. They've been able to build me up, and they've enabled me to deal with these things in a practical way before God. So the first principle that has been indispensable for me is the knowledge of God can be trusted because of not what He said, not primarily about what God said, but because of what He's done for us. So as I was struggling with my bitterness towards God, one of the things that God pointed out to me was the fact that He was not someone who was immune to suffering. He went through it. He knows what it's like, right? It would have been the easiest thing in the universe for God to do, to stay out of our suffering. He had every right and every ability to do so, but He didn't. He entered into our suffering in the most intimate way that He possibly could have. He became a human being just like you and me, with all the weaknesses and frailties that you and I experience. And He could have given Himself a prosperous life. Jesus could have been born in one of the best neighborhoods. He could have had the best education. He could have lived a life without pain or suffering, but that's not the life that He lived. He chose for Himself a life of pain and misery, suffering, and a lot of tragedy. It says in Isaiah chapter 53 that He Himself has borne our griefs and He has borne our sorrows, right? He is a man acquainted with grief and suffering, right? That's the kind of life that God chose to live. Why? Because as John Stott put it, a very famous Christian author, in this world of pain and suffering, who could possibly trust a God who is immune to it all? Right? God willingly entered into suffering just so that you and I would have a reason to trust Him in whatever we're going through. And that in itself is very beautiful and amazing, but it goes deeper than that, right? So Jesus, in His life of suffering, He didn't just take the cross. He took a lot of things leading up to the cross. He knows what it's like to go through suffering. He knows what it's like to go through rejection, abuse, and even, yes, being murdered, being executed by the people that He trusted the most, namely Judas Iscariot, who physically betrayed Him to death, but also His apostles who abandoned Him to die alone. In His moment of greatest need, His closest friends left Him, right? And these truths have been able to encourage and strengthen many Christians throughout the ages. One of my favorites is Joanne Terrell, who's a woman who's no stranger to suffering and no stranger to pain. But as a little girl, she actually witnessed her own mother being beaten to death by her mother's boyfriend. And she talks about how that sight of seeing her mom's bloody handprint on the mattress and seeing her blood splattered across the room and remembering the sounds haunted her entire life. And she said at some point in her early 20s, she was studying the cross of Jesus Christ, and it clicked for her. She realized something. She said, I serve a God who knows what it's like to be beaten to death by someone that should have loved him. And that truth, that understanding, was enough for her to gain a connection between her and her Savior, to realize, like, I don't have someone who can't relate to me. I have someone who can relate to me in the most intimate and painful moments of my life. Right? And this is another thing that we see in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He didn't just go through that for nothing. Right? When Jesus died, he died for the salvation of all, meaning that God took one of the most unrighteous events in history. And I would even argue that it was the most unrighteous event in all of history, because Jesus was the only truly innocent person who's ever existed. He took the most unrighteous event in history and he used it to save the entirety of mankind, right? Which gave her hope to believe that whatever suffering that she went through, God has a purpose. He has a plan. He's doing something with it. And that faith is what enabled her to be able to deal with what she had been through and to trust God and everything going forward in her life. And that's what I found inside of my life as well. So we don't have a God that we can't relate to. We don't have a God that can't trust. He gave us a reason to trust him, even in these intimate moments, by going through something as horribly painful and excruciating as the cross itself, for your sake and for my sake. Now, the second principle that really helped me is that the issue of God and suffering is an incredibly complex one. It's not simple. Sometimes well-meaning Christians and well-meaning people from other faith systems have tried to give small, simplistic answers for why God allows bad things into our lives. They'll say things like, well, God really wanted to stop that from happening to you. He just couldn't. There was something preventing him from being able to interfere in your life. Again, it sounds nice. It sounds nice that, God is up in heaven just like wanting to give you the best possible life and he just can't. But think about that for a second. If God's will can be overwritten either by the will of man or by the will of the universe, then that's not really a powerful God. That's a God that's inept. That's a God that's incapable. And so that doesn't give me a whole lot of comfort. That just means that we kind of got to look at the suffering and pain happening around us and just accept it. Just be like, well, God wants to stop it. You just can't, and that's too bad. The other common answer people give is, God is a loving God, but he's not all loving. He doesn't really love all of us the same. And, the people that have prosperous lives and good lives, these are the people that God really loves. And the people that have painful lives and traumatic lives, these are the people that God, he still cares about them, but he doesn't love them as much. And maybe if they were better people, he would take better care of them, right? Now, this is an incredibly horrible truth to say for two reasons. For the people who are prospering, it gives them an amount of arrogance, where they think like, well, of course I'm having such a good life. Look at what a good person I am. But the people who are having terrible lives, they have to look at it and say, it's because of me. Right? Everything I'm going through, everything I've suffered, it's ultimately because I'm a terrible person. I'll tell you something personally, something that I know from going through suffering myself. The first and most instinctive reaction that you have towards suffering is shame, because you will always feel at some level that you're responsible. So to give someone a theological truth that feeds into that fear is horribly damaging and terrible. Never say that to somebody. Not only because it's damaging, but also, and more importantly, it's not true. The Bible never says that. Okay? The next reason that some people give is some sort of the fancy word is called a Theodicy. That yes, God has allowed this in your life, but he's trying to accomplish something better, and that's why he's allowed it. Now, that is a true statement, meaning that is verified in the Bible, that God, everything that God has allowed in your life, there's a purpose for it, a good purpose for what he is allowing into your life. But where we get into trouble is we try to figure out what that purpose is in the here and now. We try to solve the problem. And here's the thing. The Bible never gives specific reasons as to why suffering happens. It never really gives those reasons. Why? Because the reason is incredibly complicated and we should never, ever, ever try to simplify it. It will always destroy those people that you're trying to help. Right? Here's a prime example of that, Job. Right, now you read the beginning of Job and you think, okay, the reason why God allowed this into Job's life is because Satan made a point. He said, Job is only faithful to you because you have given him nice things. Right? Take him away and Job's going to curse you to your face. God says, okay, go ahead and do it. So it seems like God did allow those things into Job's life to prove a point, right? To basically show that Job was a righteous and good person just because he was a righteous and good person. But at the end of the book, God responds to Job, and he never gives that as a reason as to why God allowed those things into his life. Instead, he basically goes on this long explanation of why Job should trust God's plans over his own. Right? So he never says, Job, you're suffering this because you messed up. And he never says, Job, you're suffering this because I wanted to prove a point. He could have said that, but he doesn't. Instead, he brings up a lot of interesting examples. And one of the most interesting ones is he brings up two vicious animals that lived during Job's time. They were called the behemoth and the leviathan. And they seem like these incredibly predatorial and powerful animals that probably were responsible for the deaths and the maiming of a lot of people around Job's hometown. And yet, God says these seemingly evil animals serve a good purpose. Right? What's the good purpose? He never really tells Job. He's just like, you just got to trust that I am aware that these animals exist, and there is a reason that they exist. And you got to trust me. Right? Now, in modern times, we understand things like ecosystems, and we understand that predators serve a very important role in ecosystems in maintaining the population of the prey, because they populate so much faster than the predators, and they would eat all the foliage around them and end up destroying the world, basically. So a lot of us have probably had those thoughts. Why doesn't God just take away all bears and all sharks and all lions and stuff like that? Wouldn't the world be a better place if God did that? Well, actually, no, it wouldn't be. Right? So these seemingly evil things serve good purposes. We just don't fully understand exactly why that's happening. Now, it's a very simplistic example, but God's giving that simplistic example to show Job something. Your suffering, no matter how simple it may seem, is complicated. It's incredibly complicated. Don't try to simplify someone's suffering. Right? If someone loses a child, don't say, well, maybe God saw that their life was going to be hard, so he took them early. Or, maybe, God just wanted them in heaven so badly, so he just took them away from you a little early. Don't say things like that, because that's not true, right? That's not the reason, right? Our suffering is incredibly complex. Don't try to simplify people's sufferings. The Bible doesn't, and you shouldn't either, right? They're complicated issues, and we need to treat them as such. God doesn't give us simplistic answers, but he does give us a reason why we should trust him with our suffering, which leads to the third and final principle. There is a reason for your suffering. It's just one that's too expansive, too complex, and too glorious for you to understand right now. In 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16 through the end of the chapter, Paul says this, "For we do not lose heart, though our outward man perishes, our inward man is being renewed day by day." Right? For this light, momentary affliction is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. For we don't look to the things that are seen, for the things that are seen are temporary and fading away. But we look instead to the things that are unseen, for these things are eternal. Now this is what Paul's saying. He's saying whatever you're going through, not only is there a reason for it, but there's an eternal reason for it. Right? God's intent, and even the tiniest amount of suffering in your life, is to produce for you something that is literally eternal. So no matter how much suffering you may experience, no matter how great it might be, right? As Blaise Pascal, the mathematician, once said, every number, no matter how great, is annihilated in the presence of infinity, right? No matter how great your suffering might be, no matter how long it might be, in the presence of what God's working for in your life, which is eternal and infinite, it is light and it is momentary, right? Now you might look at Paul and say, you're crazy, you don't know what I've been through. Well, I do think that Paul has earned a right to say these things. Why? Well, after giving his life to Jesus Christ, the Apostle Paul had a life of constant suffering. He gives some of the sufferings that he went through in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, right? And basically, the life that he lived after giving his life to God was a life of imprisonments, beating, incredible amounts of abuse, rejection, betrayal, right? And you can go down the list. And at the end of his life, the Apostle Paul didn't just all of a sudden get all this prosperity like Job. It didn't happen. At the end of his life, Paul was beheaded, right? That's how his life ultimately came to an end. So you look and be like, what the heck was the point of that? Right? Paul does all this work. He does all these things. He gets constantly betrayed. In 2 Timothy, which is the last book he wrote, he says, all have abandoned me, meaning he died essentially alone, right? And he just gets beheaded by some dictator in his own country. Like, what was the possible reason why God would allow that into his life? And what I could tell you is, on this side of heaven, we can see glimpses of why God allowed it, right? We can see the people who have been touched and blessed by the ministry of the Apostle Paul, still living to this day, 2,000 years after his death. But as amazing as those blessings are, they're not even the barest fraction of what God was doing. We won't understand exactly what God was doing until we pass into eternity. We see the eternal perspective of why God allowed these things into Paul's life. So don't try to understand it. As Paul puts it, don't look to the things that are seen, but instead, with the eyes of faith, look to the things that are unseen. Why should we do this? Because God has given us an example that we can trust in. He took the suffering of his Son and he gave it an eternal purpose, the salvation of all mankind. Whatever you're going through, no matter how horrible it was or how horrible it is, there is a reason, but it is eternal and infinite, and no matter how hard you try, you cannot understand it with the finite mind that you have right now. But one day you will understand it, right? It's not for us to fully grasp, it's for us to fully trust. God has given us reasons to believe, reasons to lean on his will and his sovereignty. And those reasons will get us through the horrible atrocities that have been committed to us and around us, as long as we can always look to him and see him as a worthy source of faith and trust because of not only what he said, but more importantly, what he has done. So I hope this video has helped. If you guys like it, please give it a like. Please subscribe to my channel and share it with anyone who you think might be blessed by it. And look forward to my next video where I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to forgive individuals that have hurt you in your life and how to deal with bitterness in that way. But thanks again for all your support, and I'll talk to you in a little bit.